Good morning. Good to be with you this morning. We are talking about manuscript evidence, particularly from the New Testament. This is in our How We Got the Bible study. I've told y'all several times how much I love and enjoy this study. It's very faith-building. I was laughing at myself and the stress I caused myself this morning. Some of you noticed we didn't have handouts. We do have handouts. I just hadn't cut them yet because I came in this morning and was making sure I had everything together, my PowerPoint for this morning's class. And I love this study so much, and I got studying ahead, and I realized, time got away, and so I've printed those. I just hadn't gone and cut them yet because I had to make do some more work on my sermon PowerPoint. But I do enjoy this study. It's one of those that I can't get enough of. This is where we left off last week, talking about some notes on manuscripts before we get into talking about what we sometimes call the big three, these unsealed manuscripts. But just notes on manuscripts, most of them are in vellum, or on vellum, or papyrus, and most of them are in codex form. It's some crude type of book. Some of them look more like what we would consider a book than others. Some of them not very much so, and you may recall some pictures we looked at previously. Some of them are dated, many are not. You use handwriting to determine the date. There are, again, that's the dated figure. It's closer to 5,700, 6,000 or so manuscripts in all. Many of them are not complete. Some are very small, like the John Rylands papyrus. They are generally categorized by Gospels, Acts and the general epistles, Paul's epistles, and Revelation. It would be some time before there would be a completed, at least as far as having in one book form, completed New Testament. The New Testament was complete much earlier than that, of course, but before they were collated in that fashion. And the reason for that is just because books were a lot more cumbersome. You had these codices, and they were not the easiest to put together and carry around. All of them are not equally valuable. The John Rylands papyrus, we talked about that, is far more valuable than you might think, even though it's just a little bitty piece, a little fragment, but it's because it dates so far back, close to the actual writing of the book. One thing we can be sure of, the New Testament is the best attested book of all time. There is no other book that even comes remotely close. I don't have that chart that I showed you last week just because I didn't want to review too much. But we looked at a chart last week, some ancient works and the manuscript evidence that exists for them. It's no comparison. The New Testament, with its 5,700 or 6,000 or so manuscripts, nothing even comes even remotely close. And that's just manuscripts. When we use that term, remember, we're talking about in Greek. That's not even counting Latin, and of course that was on the chart, and so on. This is where we left off, sorry. Likely the New Testament books were originally written in unsealed character, and these unsealed, we use that term, they generally are the older manuscripts. That was the older style. They would be what we would call kind of like in all caps, no spaces between the words, scarcely any punctuation, and this is what I showed you kind of as we were running out of time last week. I believe it's from Romans 1:1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. You can look at that and see that's, there's no punctuation, no separation between the words. And I tried as best I could with the full justified font in PowerPoint, but you still don't get quite even with that how meticulous they would be, where the columns had to line up. And I mean, it would be a letter like right here. You can see the P and the A. It's a little bit offset. They wouldn't have that. It would be perfectly aligned. The tip of that A would center underneath the P. I mean, it was just very meticulous. It's not just because they were so OCD. It's because that they looked at this as the most important thing in the world to them. We are copying the very Word of God. So they were super, super meticulous with it. And you'll see a little bit of that in some pictures that I have coming up in just a little bit. The other type of manuscript is called cursive. We'll look at a few of those. They date significantly later than most of the uncials, so we don't talk about them as much. The uncials are very, very, very much older. And so they carry a lot more weight in the how we got the Bible discussion than do the cursives. But these are smaller writing. They look almost like cursive. Of course, it's Greek characters, but it looks like almost a cursive version of Greek. And they're also referred to as minuscules because the letters are much smaller than those uncials, which would be like all capital Greek letters. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to those as minuscules, sometimes cursives. Now, we get to the big three. The first of these, I don't know if they're in, I guess it would depend on who you ask. Some people may say some people may rank them 1, 2, 3 in one particular order. Somebody may use a different. But these are the biggest three because they're essentially complete manuscripts of the New Testament where somebody meticulously copied word for word, letter for letter, the entire New Testament. Vatican dates to AD 325, maybe 320. Now remember, the last book of the New Testament, as far as we can tell chronologically, would have been what? As far as when it was written. Probably the book of Revelation. Late 90s, mid 90s maybe. So you see how close this is getting to that date. Again, you have some little fragments like the John Rylands papyrus. I mean, it's just, it's just a few inches tall. It's hard to even say it's a few inches wide because it's kind of jagged and parts of it are torn. But that dates even within just a few decades of the writing of the book of John. John probably was written maybe early or mid-90s, but Revelation would have been probably the last. But this Vatican manuscript was widely acknowledged. Again, this is just went blank. Lightfoot. I just lost the guy's name for a second there. Neil Lightfoot, his book, he would tell you this is, and I would say probably the most that I have read would take the position that Vatican is, if you had to rank them, the most important witness on the text of the New Testament. Anybody want to take a guess where it's located? In the Vatican Library. It's been there in the Vatican Library at Rome since at least 1481. And that library was founded in 1448, so it very well may be that this was one of the original volumes in that library. And knowing how these people revered these copies of the Scripture, it could have been like the founding volume, so to speak, of that library. We don't know that, but it's certainly a possibility. It was kept under strict guard until 1889. I certainly don't mean to pick on anybody or any particular religious group, but it's just unconscionable what was done with the Scriptures for many centuries as far as trying. I mean, I'm talking concerted efforts to keep the masses from reading Scripture. And you see that in the story of the Vatican manuscript. This manuscript contains, in Greek, again, we're talking manuscripts, and we use that term in this study. That means in the original language, so in Greek. It contains in Greek almost all of the Old Testament and New Testament. Of course, obviously the Old Testament original language was Hebrew, but this was, being in the time it was done, would have been copied. I'm trying to think if I've ever run across. I don't know if it's. I was going to say it's copied from the LXX, maybe. I'd have to do some more research. It could have been that they translated it, but my guess is that it was copied from the Septuagint, which is, of course, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But the beginning of this is lost as far as Genesis, up to Genesis 46:28. Some of the Psalms are missing, 106 through 138. The ending has also dropped off, Hebrews 9:14 through the end of that book. The letters of Timothy and Titus, and of course the book of Revelation. So there are some gaps there, but in spite of the gaps, it is considered to be the most exact New Testament copy known and the earliest of these great uncials, which is probably why so many people place this one at the top if they had to rank them, because it dates earliest. And earlier typically is better. I say typically because it depends on some other things, such as what text type is it. There are different families of texts, and we'll talk about that, and I don't know if we'll get to that today or not, but that's, you talk about Western, they tended to be not as meticulous sometimes, and sometimes they would even take some liberties. You had Byzantine text type, and you had Alexandrian. But there were differences in those families, as the term is used, of text. Now, let me tell you something before I move on from this about the Vatican Uncial manuscript. I printed out some of these notes so I'd remember all the details. This is a fascinating story in itself because of how it was found. And Sinaitic manuscripts even better, in my opinion, because it's just such an amazing story on both of these manuscripts. So the year was 1533. There was a correspondent, an unnamed, unknown correspondent of Erasmus, who sent him some selected readings from Vaticanus. And he sent that to Erasmus, and that name, if you don't recognize it, you probably will, if you just stay with our study, we'll get to him and talk about him a little bit later on. He worked trying to give the people the Bible in their own language. And of course, by many of the church authorities at that time, he was hated for that. Again, just unconscionable to try to keep the Bible from people, keep people from reading the Bible for themselves. But a correspondent of his, Erasmus, sent him some selected readings from Vaticanus, and the reason was he wanted to show the superiority of the text to what Erasmus had. He said, hey, look, there's a lot better text that you could be using. So he sent him some selected readings. Well, and there's a lot more that could be said about that without just kind of summarizing here. In 1815, so you fast forward more than a couple of centuries, to 1815, the Vatican manuscript is returned from Paris. It was taken there by Napoleon during his conquests. So it was returned in 1815 from Paris back to the Vatican. And at that point, a period of seclusion sets in. In 1843, a man named Tischendorf was very, very interested in manuscripts and studying the original, trying to get as close to the original writings of the New Testament as he could. You'll hear this name a lot when we talk about these big three uncials. Tischendorf was allowed into the Vatican to look at this manuscript. They said, we'll give you 6 hours. No more. So for 6 hours, he was allowed to go look at it. In 1844, there was a man named de Murault, if I'm pronouncing that right, who was allowed 9 hours. He got very generous with him. In 1845, this is a period of just consecutive years, Tregellus, again, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he was allowed to see it, but not to copy a single word. And in fact, when he left the Vatican, they searched him. They searched his pockets. And the manuscript even was taken away from him if he looked too long at one particular passage. They were afraid he was trying to memorize it. Fast forward to 1866, this is what, 11 years or so later. Tischendorf, again, is permitted to view the manuscript. This time he's actually permitted to collate some difficult passages. And he got so carried away in this that what he actually did was he copied 20 pages. Well, guess what happened? Permission revoked. The next year, 1867, he was able to obtain another permission. This was now 14 days of 3 hours each. 3 hours, no more. but we'll give you 14 days. At that point, Tischendorf was able to publish the best edition of Vaticanus. And I say Vaticanus, I think I've explained this maybe before. Vatican, Vaticanus, it's the same thing. Vaticanus, I think, is a Latin pronunciation of that. But some people will call it Vaticanus, some people call it Vatican. Same thing with the Sinai manuscript. We'll talk about that next. Some people call it Sinaiticus. That's the Latin version of it. Some people call it Sinai. There's the Alexandrian manuscript. That's the third of the big three. Some people call it Alexandrinus. They're all, you can figure out that they're the same. But after this second permission, or I guess it's to be third, right? Tischendorf published the best edition of Vatican or Vaticanus to that point. Now, 1868 through 1881, there's a span there. There's this improved Roman edition of Vaticanus that was published. It was published in 1889, 1890, and it's kind of a facsimile of the whole manuscript. But the beauty of Vaticanus has been a little bit marred. It's a very beautiful text, and I have just a few pictures of it we'll see in just a moment. It's a beautiful text, but some of that beauty has been marred by a later scribe, and this is kind of ironic to me, a later scribe who came along and he thought to preserve it. You know how he thought to preserve it? He started tracing over some of the lines of text and some of the letters. He thought, well, it's gonna, I don't want this thing to go and fade so much that nobody can read it. And so he's, with the best of intentions, but he actually marred some of the beauty because, no matter how meticulously you try to trace something, it's not going to be the same as the original. But here's the irony of it. It would have been just fine because he didn't do all of it. But the places where he didn't trace over letters, the original ink hasn't faded in over 1,500 years. That's pretty amazing. Printed New Testament texts today rely very heavily on Vaticanus. There are 759 leaves of the finest vellum that make up this manuscript. The pages are 10 inches by 10 inches with 3 columns each. And you'll see, one final note here before I show you a couple pictures. This Vatican manuscript does not include Mark 16, 9 through 20, but it has more than a column of blank space there. Maybe you've heard people talk about Mark 16, talk about the long ending versus the short ending of Mark, and the big debate of does it belong in the text or not. I don't know that we'll have time in our study to get real deep into that. Maybe that's something for a Q&A one Sunday night or something, but I think there's sufficient evidence that it is genuine and it does belong in the text. And sometimes people will talk about, and in fact, some Bibles will have something in like a footnote beginning at Mark 16:10, or maybe it's at the end of the book, at the end of verse 20. And sometimes they'll put a footnote. The oldest manuscripts do not include verses 10 through 20, or 9 through 20, sorry. So what about it? Well, this would be the oldest. And yeah, technically it does not, but there is a huge blank space there that it would fit in. So that's an interesting discussion. Again, I think there's sufficient evidence that it does belong, sometimes just from a common sense standpoint, because is anybody at Mark 16 right now? Brother Chris, read verse 8. All right, so Mark is a what kind of account? It's a gospel account, right? What does gospel mean? Good news. Now let's just look at this from a common sense standpoint. The good news. Mark says, hey, I'm here to tell you about the good news. This is an inspired account of the good news of Jesus Christ. And it ends with, for they were afraid. Isn't that kind of strange? So just from a common sense standpoint, it seems odd to end a gospel good news account with they went out, they didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. So, that's just from a common sense standpoint. But anyways, again, we don't have time to get into all that. That might be another discussion for another time. But here's a picture of the end of the book of Mark. Again, you see that big space here at the end of Mark. Sometimes these are categorized, by the way, these unsealed manuscripts by letters. A lot of the manuscripts, period, are categorized by letters. They had the Hebrew alphabet. I think they used the Greek alphabet. And of course, there's 5,700 or maybe 6,000 of these. So they ran out of letters, and then they just started naming them. But this was originally, sometimes it'll be referred to as Codex B, or I think it's Sinai that they refer to as Codex Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This will be B, Beth, in the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. But again, you see the three columns. You see how everything lining up, and it's just very, very beautiful text there as far as how they just, with no, they don't have lined paper or anything like that. It's just pretty amazing that you can tell somebody spent some time on that. So let's talk now about the Sinai manuscript. This one also is a very fascinating story, and I'm going to give you this one. I've got some of this, I just realized in my slide, but not all of it. Let me go ahead and pull this bullet point up. This one is almost as important as the Vatican manuscript. It was discovered, if we want to use that term, by Tischendorf at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. This was at that time in Russia. But again, let me give you a little bit of a timeline here. In 1844, Tischendorf was there. I don't have any information as far as why he was there originally, but he was given an apartment at the monastery. And this apartment had several rooms with a study. And he was given access to all the manuscripts that they had there. But there was a large basket of parchments seen by Tischendorf one day in the library of the monastery. This is a basket of parchments, just kind of picture kind of we would call just a small trash can. And parchments are just thrown in there. You want to guess why they were thrown in there? They were going to use them to start fires. Well, many of them had already been burned. He was able to take, he noticed that there were several sheets of Greek Old Testament. And again, Tischendorf, you understand, he was very, very into this type thing, and he studied these manuscripts. He'd seen a lot of different ancient manuscripts. And what he noticed about the Greek Old Testament text that he had seen, and some of those that were in the wastebasket, said it was the oldest Greek he'd ever seen. Well, he was able to take 43 sheets with him. They wouldn't allow him to take any more, but the 43 sheets he took were Greek translations of Isaiah and Jeremiah, portions of Isaiah and Jeremiah. So he left, and he told them, please don't burn any more of those. Please take great care of these manuscripts. They're old, and they're very important and very vital to this study. That was 1844. In 1853, around 9 years later, he was able to go back, and he found nothing at this point. But he kind of stumbled upon a small piece of parchment with the same handwriting as those previous 43 sheets. This small piece of parchment is just like a torn off little piece, was being used as a bookmark. These are some of the oldest manuscripts in the world, dating to within just a century or so of some of the original writings, and somebody's using them as a bookmark. It's just amazing. Well, this was a few verses of Genesis chapter 24, and that was evidence enough to convince Tischendorf that the original manuscript contained the entire Old Testament rather. So fast forward to 1859. Tischendorf again returns to St. Catherine's, finds nothing. He was set to leave in 3 days. That evening, he met with the steward of the monastery in his cell. The steward mentioned something about having read a Septuagint before, and he took down a manuscript that was wrapped in red cloth. Within that manuscript were some of the pages Tischendorf had taken 15 years previously, and a complete New Testament, along with a book called, another epistle called the Epistle of Barnabas, and a part of a book or letter called the Shepherd of Hermas. We'll talk more about those later when we start talking about New Testament canon. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, there were other books written during the first century. There were other letters. There were lots of letters, epistles written in the first century. So why do we have, say, Timothy, Ephesians, Colossians, and so on, but we don't have the Shepherd of Hermas? We don't have the Epistle of Barnabas. We'll talk about that when we talk canon. Well, this time, Tischendorf contained his excitement because they didn't like it when he got all excited about that, and that was a lot of times when they would say, no, you need to go. And that was, by the way, why when one time he came back, I think it was the second time, and they said, he found nothing. So he contained his excitement. The steward and the monastery were both offered generous, very generous amounts of money for those manuscripts. Guess what? They refused. And again, just to put it very bluntly, no other way to say it except plainly, it's just a fact. It ain't like the Catholic Church needed the money. So they refused it. They said no. Tischendorf finally was able to obtain permission to take the manuscript to Cairo, Egypt, to copy it. That's a story in itself, but anyway, once he got to Cairo, Tischendorf had two helpers who knew Greek. They copied 110,000 lines meticulously and checked them letter for letter. There were numerous corrections in the text, which made it especially challenging because you don't want the corrections, you want the original text, right? Had to be studiously registered, and they completed this project, 110,000 lines of Greek text. They completed this project in 2 months. Tischendorf's stated goal was this, quote, to clear up, and I've omitted a little bit, but basically to clear up the history of the sacred text and to recover the text, quote, which is the foundation of our faith, end quote. Originally, Sinaiticus was 730 leaves. Today, 393 remain. 245 Old Testament, 148 New Testament. The pages are approximately 15 inches by 15 inches, 4 columns to a page, except for the 7 poetic books, 7 books of poetry in the Old Testament, which have 2 columns per page. It was copied by 3 different scribes, which is distinguishable by the different spelling of words, because a lot of times scribes are having the text dictated to them. And so if a scribe misspells a word, he'll misspell it all the way through, and you can tell which scribe copied which portion by those misspelled words. It includes a lot of corrections, but these corrections are all tiny points that don't materially affect the text. Sometimes they would correct Christ Jesus to Jesus Christ, or vice versa, or Jesus the Christ, something like that. Today, getting more toward the present, this manuscript was purchased from the Russian government by the British Museum in 1933 for approximately $500,000, $500,000 in 1933. That was a lot. More than half of this was donated by the general public to purchase that manuscript. The manuscript arrived in England via train, and then an official British delegation delivered it by taxi. When it was brought from the taxi, the men removed their hats out of respect. In 1975, there were a hoard of manuscripts and art treasures discovered at St. Catherine's, that same monastery, but a fire had gutted a certain area, and so that's basically how they discovered this. A fire just devastated a certain area of the monastery. When they were removing dirt and debris, they uncovered these various manuscripts. The ceiling had apparently collapsed about 200 or so years before. More than a dozen missing leaves of Sinaiticus were found, Old Testament, of course, since the New Testament was already complete. And approximately 4,000 other manuscripts, including fragments, have been recovered. Not all of them, though, are biblical. Many are various types and subjects. Most of them are in Greek, although not every single one. But the Sinai Uncial is the oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament today. Its importance lies in its antiquity and the quality of its text. So Vatican goes a little bit earlier, but Sinai is the oldest complete copy of the New Testament. That's why I say sometimes depending on the scholar you ask, somebody may rank them one way, somebody may rank them different. But here are kind of the highlights of what we just talked about. Studies have classed this in the same type as Vaticanus, which means the two most important witnesses on the Greek New Testament are Vatican and Sinai. Again, more than a dozen missing leaves of the Old Testament have since been discovered, and they, as of Lightfoot's book's publication, the third edition, they remain the property of the monastery. I suspect that's still true today as well. So, very, very fascinating story there with the Sinai manuscript. There you see a picture of St. Catherine's Monastery, and again, this is at the foot of Mount Sinai over in that area. Another picture of the monastery. There's your text of the 4-column section. And you can see kind of where the paragraphs end. But a very, very careful copy made, and there's a look at it opened up. Here it is arriving in England. This is, again, 1933. You see the gentlemen all have their hats off. It was a very solemn occasion. These are all, state officials. Imagine that today. You probably would not see such today from state officials as far as political officials. That's very interesting. Got somebody on hand to make some pictures and such. There's Sinaiticus on display in the British Library today, or at least fairly recently, within the last 20, 30 years or so. But you could go and you could actually see it opened up like that. And then let's talk about the Alexandrian Uncial. This dates to about AD 450. So again, you're about, 100, what do we say, 350 on Sinai? 340. So 110 years or so after Sinai. But this is a very important Uncial manuscript as well. It is called Alexandrian, or Alexandrinus, again, same term, same manuscript. Because it was in Alexandria, Egypt, for several centuries. This contains both the Old Testament and New Testament, mostly complete. It has 10 leaves missing from the Old Testament, but the New Testament has suffered more loss. You see the text listed there, Matthew 1:1 through 25:6 is missing. John 6:50 through 8:52, missing. And a portion of 2 Corinthians, a large portion of 2 Corinthians as well. Now this manuscript includes 1 Clement and 2 Clement, appended at the end of the New Testament. Again, we'll talk about this more when we talk about canon, but 2 Clement is a sermon, really, from the mid-2nd century. 1 Clement is a letter written, presumably, by Clement of Rome, somewhere around AD 95. So why, sometimes people say, well, why are these included in this manuscript? It's a very, very important manuscript, and we don't have them in our Bibles today. Well, there were some areas, Egypt in other words, in some of those areas of the world, of the very early Palestinian area and slightly beyond there, Clement may have had canonical or even semi-canonical status among some of those people. Alexandrinus is the only Greek manuscript, though, to include 1 Clement. And again, we'll talk more about all that when we get to talking about the canon of the New Testament. I'll say this, and we'll say it again when we talk about canon. These folks in those early centuries after Christ, and even for several centuries after, they were not as ignorant or naive as some people want to make them out to be, like they were just kind of flippantly choosing which books they're going to include. And I'll say they weren't as irreverent as some people make them out to be. It's almost like some people say, in fact, some people will say, well, did you know there was just a vote? There was some kind of a council, and that's the reason you have certain books included and some books that are left out, is because a narrow vote of a council that decided, we're not going to include that one or we're going to include this one. Come on. They were not that flippant. They were not that naive. They were not that ignorant. And again, we'll discuss that a lot more in depth when we get to talking about canon of the Bible and particularly the New Testament. So there's a look at Codex Alexandrinus, some of the text of it. Again, you can see that just very, very, it's just, to me, it's amazing how straight they write, because I don't know about y'all, but I can't write straight if my life depends on it, if I don't have lines, and sometimes even then, I can't write straight. Now, just to review very quickly the big three, as we sometimes say, these important uncials. Two basic types of manuscripts, uncials and cursives. Uncials, all caps, little or no punctuation, little or no spacing between words. And again, you'll see that here. You don't see punctuation, you don't see spacing. That's several, what we would call several verses of text, but there's no period to tell you when a new sentence starts. There's no spacing to tell you when a new word starts. And like in English, an S that runs with another letter, well, is it starting a new word, or is it making the word before it plural? And so, and it's, you can usually determine that from the context, but it does make things more difficult. The vellum uncials date to around the 4th century, making them the most valuable. That's the ones we've been talking about just now. The big three uncials are Vatican, Sinai, and Alexandrian. Vatican has been in the Vatican Library since at least 1481. Tischendorf had a large part in finding the Sinai manuscript, and the British Library today houses both Alexandrian and Sinai manuscripts. It's got both of those manuscripts. So the other one, of course, remains in the Vatican. So anything, questions or comments on those? We'll talk about some other important manuscripts. And there's some history there. I know not everybody's into history, but it's fascinating to see the efforts that people would go to try to obtain the text, and to say we want to make sure we have the correct text that's true to the originals. We want to study it, and eventually we want to translate it and put it in the hands of the masses so they can study the scriptures for themselves, as the New Testament teaches us to do. And I just, to me, I'm very humbled, and sometimes even, if I'm honest, ashamed, because we have this book so easily accessible, and the lack of effort that we sometimes put into studying it. And it's one of the reasons why, to me, this is such a faith-building study. It's such an encouraging study, because I look at people, many of whom literally gave their lives to put the Bible in the hands of as many people as possible in their vernacular, their own language. And it's hard sometimes to get us to even open our Bibles up and study. Sometimes hard to get folks to open their Bible up and study inside the four walls of the building. And sometimes even harder to get folks to study on their own at home. But a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, as we say, went into bringing us the Bible in such accessible form. Let's talk. I think we got time to talk about it. Maybe one or two of these other important manuscripts. One of them being the Codex of Ephraem. This dates to around the 5th century, AD, of course. This uncial is what we call a palimpsest. And to explain that a little bit further, of course, obviously in ancient times, writing materials were hard to come by. And so sometimes what people would do is take an old parchment, wash or scrape off the ink, and then use it as if it were new. And so it came to be known as a scraped again manuscript, or the Greek term is palimpsest. Chemical reagents would be applied to bring out the older layer, and then that's how they've discovered the actual biblical text of this. They have chemicals that they can use to bring out the older layer, And today, of course, we have ultraviolet photography and computer-enhanced images and things like that, a lot of technology now that helps with this. The original, or Ephraem, originally contained both the Old and New Testaments. Several leaves, of course, have been since torn off, lost. Around the 12th century, somebody took the remaining leaves and copied 38 sermons of Ephraem of Syria over the biblical text. Now, isn't that a commentary? Well, you could just preach a sermon on that, putting our words over the Word of God. And again, they probably didn't think much of it at the time, but it marred a very critical manuscript. Thankfully, again, with technology and such, we've been able to find and see that original text, much of it at least. In 1840, Tischendorf was able to decipher the biblical text. Again, you see his name come up a lot. He did. We owe a lot to him for being able to have our Bible in such easily accessible form today. There's a lot of it missing from the Old Testament. There are New Testament leaves from every single book except 2 Thessalonians and 2 John. It is a very important manuscript. Don't get me wrong, Ephraem is a very important manuscript, but it just doesn't measure up to the significance and importance of those 4th century uncials, Vatican, Sinai, Alexandrian. And there's a picture of the Codex of Ephraem. And again, you can see where it's kind of marred and been written over. I don't even know how they would have read that written over, honestly. Of course, it's been a long time. It probably looked better originally. But to show you a close-up, right up here, you can see in the column and the blank space, Kata Lukan, according to Luke. So that's where at least part of the book of Luke was. And this small text, I don't know if you folks in the back can read it, but that's just citing a source there, Kurt Alon, Barbara Alon, Text of the New Testament. But that's where that picture comes from. So let's talk about Codex Bezae, and then I want to get to let me do this one quick because we can get to the three families real quick. Codex Bezae dates to around the late 5th or 6th century BC. Not BC, AD, 5th or 6th century. This is named for Theodore Bezae, a Protestant reformer who possessed the manuscript for over 20 years. It was presented to the Cambridge University Library in England in 1581. This contains, again with gaps, the 4 gospel accounts, Acts, and a fragment of 3 John that is kind of randomly in Latin. It is viewed with suspicion because of some unique readings, and you see the passage there, Luke 9:55, 23:53, Acts 12:10, and 28:31. But it's one of the earliest examples of a group of texts known as Western that is characterized by a fondness for paraphrase, textual expansions, and some striking omissions. And this is, again, gets when we talk about families of text. But the value of Bezae is in its exceedingly more agreements with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. It agrees with them far more than it differs. Now, let me do this very quickly. Here are those 3 types of text, or families of text. Alexandrian, associated with Alexandria, Egypt, represented by Vatican and Sinai manuscripts. Western, this is an early text form characterized by a fondness for paraphrase, textual expansions, and striking omissions. And then you have Byzantine, associated with the Byzantine world of the Middle Ages. This is found in the mass majority of the later manuscripts. Most of your later manuscripts are going to be Byzantine. They're very useful, but not as useful or as significant, as important as Alexandrian and Western. The problem with Western is sometimes, again, they liked paraphrase, they liked sometimes expanding the text, and sometimes they just sort of randomly would omit things. But there are your 3 types or families of text, and what we'll do next week, Lord willing, is look at just a few other, just kind of a hit very quickly, a few other uncials of note. We'll talk about just a few important cursives or minuscules, and then we'll move from there into the next part of our study. Thank y'all very much. Let's have a break before our worship period begins this morning.